The first thing that felt wrong that morning wasn't the woman kneeling beside my truck. It was how comfortable she looked doing it. She wasn't sneaking around like a thief. She looked like she honestly believed she owned the right to be there. Then she slid a brass key toward my driver's door, smiled to herself, and that's when I realized my quiet little neighborhood had finally crossed a line none of us could pretend not to see anymore. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for nearly 9 years I'd lived in the Cedar Hollow Estate subdivision outside Lexington, Kentucky. It wasn't one of those luxury developments people brag about online. It was just a peaceful neighborhood where kids still rode bicycles after dinner, retired couples walked their dogs before sunset, and people waved because they actually recognized each other instead of reading each other's license plates. I liked it because nobody knew much about my job. I preferred it that way. After 25 years in law enforcement, I'd learned the quieter life became, the happier I was. My pickup looked old enough to belong to a high school football coach. My lawn wasn't perfect. My porch swing squeaked every time the wind picked up. That was exactly how I wanted it. Then came Vanessa Crowley. She moved into the neighborhood almost 2 years earlier and somehow managed to become HOA president within 6 months. Some people have a gift for bringing neighbors together. Vanessa had a gift for convincing everyone they needed supervision. At first, it was harmless enough. Friendly reminder emails about trash bins, notices asking people to trim bushes, suggestions about mailbox colors. Most of us rolled our eyes, laughed about it at weekend barbecues, and moved on. But somewhere along the way, suggestions became directives. Directives became threats. And before anyone realized it, Vanessa had turned a volunteer position into something that looked suspiciously like a tiny government with only one elected official and absolutely no checks on her imagination. Every month, there was a new committee: Neighborhood Beautification Committee, Emergency Readiness Committee, Parking Compliance Task Force. Half of them existed only because Vanessa printed official-looking letterheads on expensive paper. My neighbor, Walt Henderson, once joked that if she stayed president another year, she'd probably create the Department of Lawn Security. We laughed harder than we probably should have because deep down everyone knew it wasn't entirely impossible. The strange thing was, she never targeted everyone equally. She always picked one person at a time. For 3 weeks, she'd obsess over somebody's fence, and suddenly lose interest and move to another house. It was like watching a storm wander across the subdivision looking for its next victim. Eventually, that storm found my driveway. It started with photographs. Every morning I'd leave for work and notice Vanessa standing across the street holding her phone chest high, pretending to admire flowers while somehow taking 20 pictures of my truck. One afternoon I actually waved. She didn't wave back. She zoomed in on my front bumper instead. A few days later an envelope appeared on my porch claiming my vehicle exceeded acceptable visual community standards. I searched through the HOA handbook twice. That phrase didn't exist anywhere. Neither did the fine she demanded I pay. I ignored it. Another notice arrived 3 days later. Then another. Soon she claimed my truck represented an emergency access concern. I almost laughed out loud because the truck was parked entirely inside my own driveway without blocking a sidewalk, hydrant, or anyone else's property. Still, I let it go. Experience had taught me something valuable. Most conflicts disappear when one side refuses to feed them. Unfortunately, that rule only works with reasonable people. Vanessa seemed energized by silence. The less I reacted, the more creative she became. She placed bright orange warning flags beside my driveway one weekend while I was visiting my sister. My security camera showed her measuring the distance from my mailbox to the curb after midnight. Another time, she actually crouched beside my rear tire with a clipboard while muttering measurements into a voice recorder. Waltz caught her doing it and asked what she was measuring. She smiled without looking up and answered, "Potential liability." Nobody knew what that meant. I don't think she knew either. Then rumors started spreading through the neighborhood. Mrs. Alvarez said Vanessa had tried opening the side gate to her backyard because she suspected an unauthorized storage shed. Trevor Mills claimed she looked through his garage windows while he was eating dinner. A young couple across the block found handwritten notes taped to their front door quoting HOA regulations that didn't actually exist. Every story sounded just unbelievable enough that people questioned themselves before questioning Vanessa. Maybe we're overreacting. Maybe she's just enthusiastic. Maybe this is what HOA presidents are supposed to do. That's how people slowly surrender common sense, one small excuse at a time. Looking back now, I think the turning point happened at our spring community meeting. Vanessa stood at the front holding a stack of papers nearly an inch thick. She announced a brand new initiative called Emergency Residential Access Verification. According to her, every homeowner needed to ensure authorized HOA representatives could quickly inspect vehicles and garages during neighborhood emergencies. Hands immediately shot into the air. Someone asked where the authority came from. She smiled confidently and replied, "The board has broad discretionary powers." Another resident asked which page of the bylaws explained that. Vanessa changed the subject so smoothly you'd think she'd rehearsed the answer for weeks. I watched the room carefully. Some people looked confused. Others looked intimidated. Nobody looked convinced. Yet somehow, the meeting ended without anyone stopping her. Walking back to my truck afterward, Walt caught up beside me and quietly said, "She's going to push too far one day." I remember smiling and answering, "Eventually she'll push the wrong person." I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't even thinking about myself. I simply believed every abuse of authority eventually runs into reality. I just had no idea reality would arrive on my front porch before my coffee had time to cool. By the next morning, I'd almost convinced myself Vanessa would finally back off. People like that usually stop once they realize somebody isn't intimidated. Instead, I walked onto my front porch with a fresh cup of coffee and found her kneeling beside my truck, one hand bracing herself against the driver's door while the other carefully guided a polished brass key toward the lock. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was still waking up. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't nervous. She looked focused, almost proud, like this was another routine duty on a checklist only she could see. "Morning," I said calmly. She jerked around so fast the key slipped from her fingers and landed on the driveway with a metallic click. Her eyes widened, but only for a heartbeat. Then the expression changed into something rehearsed. "You're interfering with an emergency HOA access verification," she declared, straightening her cardigan as if she'd just caught me doing something wrong. I stared at her, then at the key lying on the concrete. "You were trying to unlock my truck. I was attempting authorized community access. Those are very different sentences." She folded her arms. "You homeowners never understand preventative safety." Before I could answer, she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and in the calmest voice imaginable reported that a resident was obstructing an official emergency inspection. It was one of the strangest conversations I'd ever witnessed. She described herself as though she represented a public agency instead of an HOA. She described me as aggressive despite the fact I hadn't moved an inch. When she finished, she looked at me with absolute confidence. "The deputies will explain your obligations." I almost smiled. "I'm sure they will." 10 minutes later, 2 patrol units rolled into the cul-de-sac. Neighbors drifted onto porches without pretending they weren't watching anymore. Walt leaned against his mailbox with crossed arms. "Mrs. Alvarez," whispered something to her husband. Vanessa marched toward the first deputy before he even stepped out of the cruiser, waving a thick binder full of printed regulations. "Officer, this resident has repeatedly refused mandatory access inspections. I attempted compliance verification and he obstructed me." The deputy accepted the binder politely but never opened it. Instead, he looked toward me, paused for half a second, and his expression shifted. "Morning, Sheriff." Vanessa blinked. "Sheriff?" I nodded. "Morning, Daniel." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the whole street. Vanessa looked from him to me, waiting for someone to laugh and admit it was a joke. Nobody did. Daniel picked up the brass key from my driveway using an evidence glove from his cruiser. "Ma'am?" he asked evenly. "Where did you obtain this?" "It's an HOA emergency access key." "There is no such thing. Our president approved it." "You are the president." For the first time since I'd met her, Vanessa had no immediate response. Another deputy began photographing the truck, the driveway, the key, and the security cameras mounted beneath my porch roof. I invited them inside to review the footage. The video removed every possible misunderstanding. It showed Vanessa arriving before sunrise, looking around the street, removing the key from her purse, and attempting to unlock my government-issued vehicle before I'd even opened the front door. Watching it in my living room, Daniel slowly shook his head. "She called us," he muttered, while committing the offense she wanted us to investigate. Outside, word spread faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in Cedar Hollow had heard some version of the story. My phone buzzed non-stop. Some neighbors apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others quietly admitted they'd received violation letters that never made sense but were too afraid of escalating the conflict. By late afternoon, the sheriff's office had opened a formal inquiry, but something unexpected happened alongside it. The truth gave people courage. Mrs. Alvarez produced video of Vanessa trying to unlatch her backyard gate. Trevor Mills shared security footage showing her measuring his driveway after midnight. A retired teacher named Carol admitted she'd paid 2 fabricated fines because she was afraid of losing access to the neighborhood pool. Every new conversation uncovered another incident. Individually, each one looked minor. Together, they painted the picture of someone who had slowly convinced herself that confidence could replace legal authority. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that evening. For months, they'd allowed Vanessa to dominate every discussion because it was easier than arguing with her. Now they wanted distance. They wanted explanations. They wanted to know why homeowners were forwarding copies of letters bearing committee names that had never been approved. Vanessa arrived carrying 3 binders and enough confidence for all of them combined. She insisted everything she'd done was necessary. Leadership requires initiative, she announced. Sometimes you have to move faster than procedure. One board member quietly replied, "Procedure exists so nobody mistakes personal opinion for authority." The room went silent. I wasn't there to accuse anyone. I simply answered questions when asked. The deputies explained the evidence collected that morning. The association's attorney asked Vanessa to identify the bylaw authorizing emergency vehicle access. She flipped through page after page without finding it. Then she argued it was implied. The attorney calmly answered, "Powers affecting private property are never implied." I watched something change in the room. It wasn't anger. It was realization. The board members finally understood they hadn't merely elected an overenthusiastic volunteer. They had spent nearly 2 years enabling someone who believed every challenge to her opinion was a challenge to the neighborhood itself. As the meeting ended, homeowners remained standing in small groups long after the chairs should have been empty. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors were suddenly happening in the open. People compared notices. They compared dates. They compared stories. Piece by piece, the same pattern emerged every single time. Vanessa never started with outrageous demands. She always began with something just reasonable enough to avoid resistance. Then she pushed a little farther. Then farther again. Until one morning she found herself standing in my driveway with a brass key. Convinced she had every right in the world to use it. She had no idea that tiny piece of polished metal had just unlocked something much bigger than my truck ever could. It had unlocked every secret she'd spent 2 years hiding. And by the time the sun set over Cedar Hollow, the investigation was no longer about one driveway, one vehicle, or one argument between neighbors. It had become a question the entire community could no longer ignore. How had they allowed one person to mistake borrowed authority for absolute power? The final board meeting felt less like an HOA gathering and more like the last scene of a courtroom drama where everyone already knew how the verdict would end. The clubhouse was packed long before the meeting officially started. Homeowners who hadn't attended a single meeting in years suddenly filled every chair, every wall, every corner near the coffee table. Nobody came because they cared about landscaping anymore. They came because they wanted to see whether someone who had spent nearly 2 years acting like the neighborhood's self-appointed ruler would finally have to answer for it. Vanessa walked in wearing the same confident smile she'd worn for months. But confidence has a different sound when it echoes through a silent room. She looked around expecting supporters. Instead, she found neighbors avoiding eye contact. The board's attorney opened with a simple statement. This meeting concerns actions taken outside the authority granted by the association. No dramatic speeches. No raised voices. Just facts. One document after another appeared on the projector. Security footage, emails, fabricated notices, invented committee names, receipts for unauthorized purchases, the fake emergency access policy she presented as official. Every time another exhibit appeared, another piece of the story she'd built for herself quietly disappeared. Vanessa tried interrupting more than once. I was protecting the community. People expected leadership. No one complained until now. But every explanation sounded smaller than the evidence sitting in front of her. When my turn came to speak, I stood without rushing. This was never about my truck, I said, or my driveway. It was about believing authority comes from confidence instead of accountability. Real authority doesn't need to invent rules. It follows them first. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then Walt nodded. Mrs. Alvarez nodded. Soon dozens of neighbors did the same. It wasn't support for me. It was relief that someone had finally said what everyone had been thinking for months. Within 20 minutes, the board voted unanimously to remove Vanessa as president pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. They also voted to void every unauthorized violation notice she'd issued. refund improperly collected fines, dissolve every unofficial committee, and commission an independent review of the HOA's procedures. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It sounded exhausted, like a neighborhood finally putting down a weight it didn't realize it had been carrying. Outside the clubhouse, the evening air felt strangely peaceful. Families stood talking in small groups instead of rushing back to their cars. Kids chased each other across the grass without anyone worrying whether the HOA would measure the length of the footprints they left behind. Walt walked over, handed me a paper cup of coffee, and laughed. "Remember when I said she'd push the wrong person someday?" I smiled. "She didn't push the wrong person," I answered. "She pushed past the limits of common sense." A few months later, Cedar Hollow looked different, not because the houses changed, but because the people did. Meetings became conversations instead of lectures. Rules became transparent. New board members asked for opinions instead of demanding obedience. Neighbors who had stopped talking to each other started borrowing tools again, watching each other's dogs during vacations, and waving across driveways like they used to. As for Vanessa, I heard she eventually moved away. I don't know whether she ever admitted she had gone too far, and honestly, that wasn't my concern anymore. Justice isn't always about humiliating someone. Sometimes it's simply about making sure they no longer have the opportunity to repeat the same mistake. Looking back, I still think about that brass key. It never unlocked my truck. Instead, it unlocked the truth about what happens when someone mistakes a little authority for unlimited power. If there's one lesson I carried away from all of this, it's that healthy communities aren't built on fear, endless violations, or people searching for control. They're built on trust, respect, and neighbors willing to protect each other's rights instead of testing their limits. Now I'd like to hear what you think. Did Vanessa genuinely believe she was helping the neighborhood? Or did power slowly convince her that the rules no longer applied to her? And if you'd been living in Cedar Hollow, at what point would you have stepped in? Share your thoughts in the comments because conversations like this are often where the best lessons begin. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more neighborhood justice stories, and share with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA that forgot who it was supposed to serve.